Randolph Scott, Gay Love, 12 years of living together with Cary Grant and the secret Bachelor Hall. Lessons from the trenches, the echo of artillery. Hello there, I'm Tony Sinclair. Today, I want to share a story about a man who learned life's most vital lesson, not under the glittering lights of Hollywood, but in the mud-soaked trenches of France. The spring of 1917. World War I was at its most merciless peak. A 19-year-old boy from Virginia named George Randolph Scott enlisted in the United States Army Cavalry. He wasn't a battlefield hero in the way the movies later portrayed. He was just a young engineer sent to the Argonne Front, a place where the thunder of artillery never ceased and death was a constant, uninvited guest. The first lesson: silence as survival. In those trenches, Randolph learned a hard truth. The survivors weren't the ones screaming or playing the hero. They were the ones who knew how to be silent at the exact right moment. When a German patrol passed by, you held your breath. When the shells fell, you stayed still. When a wounded comrade cried out, you had to stifle the instinct to run to them, because doing so would only mean 2 deaths instead of 1. Silence wasn't weakness. It was a survival tactic. Randolph survived 14 months at the front. When he returned to the States in 1918, he brought back a medal and a lesson etched into his very marrow. There are things that, when kept hidden, keep you safe. From the battlefield to Hollywood. 14 years later, in 1932, Randolph Scott had become a rising star in Hollywood. He played the cowboys, the frontiersman, the perfect embodiment of American ruggedness and masculinity. But behind those roles, he was facing a new kind of war. A war without gunfire or bombs, but one no less perilous. It was the struggle to protect a truth that, if revealed, would end everything he had built. His love for a man named Cary Grant. And once again, the lesson from the French trenches would save him. Silence was survival. But this time, the silence wouldn't just last 14 months. It would last 54 years. The lone photograph. In 1987, 3 months after Randolph Scott passed away, his son Christopher was clearing out his father's study. He found a small, locked iron box. The key was in a drawer alongside relics from the Great War, medals, dog tags, and a weathered field diary. When he opened the box, there was no gold, no secret will, only a single photograph. A black and white snapshot from 1933. 2 men standing in front of a white beach house. One was Christopher's father, Randolph Scott. The other was Cary Grant. But the mystery wasn't who was in the photo. It was how it had been preserved. The photograph was set in a reinforced glass frame, wrapped in red velvet, held as if it were a sacred treasure to be protected from the ravages of time. On the back, a handwritten note, 1932 to 1944, Bachelor Hall. The only place we were free. The promise. Today, I'm taking you back to that house, Bachelor Hall, an address the world tried its best to strike from Hollywood's history. I'm going to tell you how a soldier applied trench warfare to his private life, turning silence into an impenetrable fortress. This isn't a story about fear. This is a story of strategy, of how a man fought not with his voice, but with his absence. And when you understand that strategy, you'll see Randolph Scott not as a victim, but as one of Hollywood's greatest master tacticians. Bachelor Hall, the fortress of freedom, a house before it had a name. The year was 1932, Santa Monica, California. A modest white Spanish-style house stood at 2177 West Live Oak Drive. Rent, $75 a month. Randolph Scott had just signed with Paramount. His salary was $150 a week, a small fortune for a newcomer in those days. He could have easily leased a penthouse in the heart of Los Angeles, but he chose not to. He chose this beach house instead. Remote, quiet, free from the prying eyes of neighbors. A place where, if you wanted to vanish from the public's glare, you truly could. And he didn't live alone. He shared that space with a 28-year-old young man named Archibald Leach, the man the world would soon come to know as Cary Grant. Why did they choose each other? They met on the set of Hot Saturday. It was a romantic flick that few remember today, but for them, it was the beginning of everything. Cary Grant was a man draped in insecurity. Born poor in England, he had crossed the Atlantic with a dream of becoming someone. Yet, amidst the blinding lights of Hollywood, he often felt like an imposter in his own skin. Randolph Scott was the exact opposite. He was the man who had seen death in the trenches. He knew that life was far too short and far too precious to spend it living out someone else's script. Perhaps that's why they chose one another. Cary needed a man who could offer him a sense of gravity, a steady hand. Randolph needed someone to give him a reason to keep believing in the sheer beauty of life. Life at Bachelor Hall. They didn't call it Bachelor Hall at first. That name came later, when reporters began to sniff around the idea of two handsome stars sharing a roof. But to them, it was simply home. In the mornings, Randolph would rise early, brew the coffee, and read the papers on the porch overlooking the Pacific. Cary was the one who liked to sleep in, waking up at 9 and playfully grumbling that Randolph hadn't saved him any toast. In the afternoons, they would swim. Cary was a natural in the water. Randolph, well, he wasn't much of a swimmer, but he loved to float on the surface, staring up at the vast blue sky. At night, they cooked together. Cary enjoyed experimenting with complex recipes from French cookbooks, often ending in burnt pans and laughter. Randolph kept it simple, sticking to Southern comfort: bacon, eggs, and cornbread. And late at night, after the neighborhood lights had flickered out, they would sit on the beach, listening to the rhythm of the waves, and speak of the dreams they dared not share with anyone else. The strategy of hiding in plain sight. Randolph knew they couldn't hide forever. The only way to protect a secret was to make it so obvious that no one would think to question it. So, when magazines like Photoplay asked for photographs, he agreed. Not just for one, but for dozens. Pictures of them cooking in the kitchen, pictures of them tinkering with a car, pictures of them swimming, reading scripts, just being pals. Paramount loved it. They used the images for publicity. Hollywood's two most eligible bachelors. The American public was charmed. They saw a beautiful friendship between two young men at the top of their game. They didn't look closer. In truth, they didn't want to look closer. That was Randolph's genius. He knew that sometimes the best way to hide a treasure is to place it right in front of people, under a label that makes them feel comfortable. It's like how gold was hidden during the wars, not buried deep in the earth, but melted down into everyday objects, a key, a button, and left sitting right on the table. No one ever suspects that something so ordinary is actually a fortune. Spring, 1934. But every strategy has a weakness, and Randolph's weakness was this: he could not control the world outside. Spring, 1934. Cary Grant received a phone call from the executives at Paramount. The moment Cary hung up, Randolph knew. He saw it in the shadow that crossed Cary's face. The life they had meticulously built over the last 2 years was under threat. The danger wasn't coming from an outside enemy. It was coming from the very system they served. Hollywood had discovered something, and the studio system was not a place that allowed for anything it could not control. The phone call and the rules of survival. The emergency meeting. Paramount never spoke directly. In those days, the big studios never addressed such matters with plain words. They simply invited Cary Grant to an urgent contractual meeting. When Cary stepped into the executive office, 3 men were waiting: a lawyer, a public relations specialist, and a representative from an organization known as the Legion of Decency. There were no questions. There were no overt threats. There was only a friendly recommendation. "Cary, You're our rising star. But there are whispers, unfortunate rumors, circulating about you and Randolph Scott, about that beach house. We think it would be best for your image if you married. Soon. As soon as possible. They had even prepared the bride, Virginia Cherrill, a beautiful actress in need of a publicity boost, a marriage of mutual convenience. The deadline? 2 weeks. That night at Bachelor Hall. Cary returned to Bachelor Hall at 7 that evening. Randolph was in the kitchen, and the heavy scent of frying bacon filled the air. Cary said nothing. He just sat at the dining table, staring blankly at an empty plate. Randolph understood instantly. He set down his spatula, turned off the stove, and sat across from Cary. What did they say? Cary didn't look up. They want me to marry within 2 weeks. A long, heavy silence followed. The only sound was the rhythmic, indifferent pulse of the Pacific surf outside the window. Then, Randolph spoke a sentence that Cary would remember for the rest of his life. Then, that is what you must do. Trench rule number 2. Cary looked up, startled. What are you saying? Randolph sighed. You have to do it. If you refuse, they will dismantle your career. They'll blacklist you. You'll lose everything you've worked for. But what about us? We will be fine. Randolph reached out and took Cary's hand. Remember what I told you about the trenches? About the rules of survival? Cary nodded, tears welling in his eyes. Rule number 1, silence keeps you alive. Rule number 2, you surrender the tactic to win the strategy. Randolph stood up, opened a drawer, and pulled out a weathered old map. When the Germans surrounded us, we didn't always charge. We retreated, we waited, and we struck back when they least expected it. You will marry. You will play the role of the perfect husband. But it's just camouflage. Just like we camouflaged Bachelor Hall into a bachelor's paradise. And what about you? Me? Randolph gave a somber smile. I'll do what I'm best at. I'll wait. The wedding and the promise. February 22nd, 1934. Cary Grant married Virginia Cherrill in London. The press went into a frenzy. Paramount threw a lavish celebration. Randolph Scott was not there. He stayed in California, telling the newspapers he was tied up with filming. But the truth was, on that wedding night, he sat alone at Bachelor Hall. On the table before him sat a bottle of sleeping. He picked it up, staring at the small white tablets. In his mind, he heard the echoes of artillery from the Argonne, the cries of his comrades, and the voice of the sergeant who had trained him. Scott, if you want to live, you must learn to endure pain without reacting. That is the art of survival. Randolph set the bottle down. He opened the refrigerator, took out a beer, and sat on the beach until the first light of dawn. As the sun rose, he made his choice. He would live, not to fight, but to wait, because he believed Cary would return. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but one day, when the velvet curtains finally fell, Cary would find his way back to Bachelor Hall, and Randolph would be there, holding the door open. 3 months later, May 1934. Cary Grant called Randolph at 11 o'clock at night. Randy, I can't live like this. I know. This marriage, it isn't real. I know. I want to go home, Cary whispered, his voice breaking. Randolph was silent for a moment. Then he spoke softly. Then come home. The door is open. And that was how they survived for the next 42 years. Never public, never perfect, but bound by a steel-clad rule. They would always have a place to return to. A place the world didn't know. A place where they were finally free to be themselves. The Life of the Guardian. The Waiting Room at Cedars-Sinai. July 1966, Los Angeles. Randolph Scott sat in the waiting room of Cedars-Sinai Hospital. He wasn't there because he was ill. He was there because he was waiting for news on a friend. That friend was Montgomery Clift, a man of immense, fragile talent, a 3-time Oscar nominee. But now he lay in the emergency room, the victim of a desperate overdose. Randolph didn't come as a Hollywood peer. He came as a man who had sat with Monty at a quiet, private dinner back in 1951. The night Monty first confessed he couldn't keep up the charade anymore. Back then, Randolph told him, "You don't have to pretend for me, but you must pretend for them, because that is the only way you survive." Monty didn't listen. He tried to fight the system. He tried to live his truth out loud. And now, he was paying the ultimate price. Learning the art of not saving. A nurse stepped out. "Are you a relative of Mr. Clift?" "No," Randolph replied softly. "I'm just a friend." "I'm very sorry. He's passed away." Randolph simply nodded. There were no tears, no outward display of grief, just a profound, hollow silence that only those who have stood in a trench can truly understand. On the drive home, Randolph's mind drifted back to a night at the Argonne in 1918. A comrade had been hit badly, lying in the no-man's land between the trenches. The man was screaming for help. Randolph wanted to run out, but his sergeant held him back with a grip like iron. "If you run out there, you die. If you try to save him, you both die. If you stay, at least you live to fight tomorrow." That was the most brutal lesson of the war. Sometimes the only way to survive is to learn how not to save. Randolph had applied that lesson for 40 years. He couldn't save Monty. He couldn't save any of them. All he could do was survive. And remember. Dinner with the Joker. The year was 1980. Randolph was 82 years old. He rarely saw old friends anymore, but that night he accepted a dinner invitation from Cesar Romero, the man the world loved as the Joker in the Batman series. They didn't talk about movies. They spoke of the thing they never mentioned to anyone else, how they had survived in a world that had no place for them. Cesar asked, "Randy, do you have regrets about never telling the truth?" Randolph thought for a long moment. "No, because if I had spoken, they would have taken the only thing I truly own, the memory of Bachelor Hall. They would have turned it into a scandal, a tabloid headline. And when Cary looked back, he wouldn't see love. He would only see drama." Cesar nodded slowly. "Then you won." "No." Randolph gave a somber smile. "I simply survived. Victory is a luxury far too expensive for people like us." The final call from Rock Hudson, September 1985. The phone rang at 2 in the morning. Randolph knew exactly who it was. Rock Hudson. A friend he'd known since the 50s. The man the public worshipped as the ultimate symbol of masculinity, now lying in a hospital bed, ravaged by AIDS. "Randy, I'm scared." "I know." "How will they remember me?" Randolph remained silent for a beat. Then he said, "They will remember you as a star. But those of us who know, who truly understand, we will remember you as a man who fought until the very last second." "You'll still keep the secret, won't you?" "Always." "Thank you. Thank you for being the last one who remembers who we really were." Rock Hudson passed away 2 weeks later. And once again, Randolph Scott did not attend the funeral. He knew his presence would only invite questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Instead, he sat in his study, opened that small iron box, and looked at the photo of Bachelor Hall. Then, he added one final line to his diary. "Rock has gone home. Only Cary and I remain. But for how much longer?" The art of survival. In an interview in 1985, someone asked Randolph Scott, "You're 87 years old. what is the secret to your longevity?" Randolph laughed. "I learned it from the war. Don't fight battles you can't win. Don't say things you can't take back. And never, ever let anyone know what truly matters to you, unless you trust them to protect it with their very life." The reporter laughed, thinking it was just a charming quip from a graceful old gentleman. But Randolph wasn't joking. He was telling the truth, a truth no one could possibly grasp unless they had lived in the shadows for 50 years.
A letter to a comrade.
Cary Grant's final curtain. November 29th, 1986. Randolph Scott was sitting in his study when the telephone rang. It wasn't Cary on the other end. It was Cary's daughter, Jennifer Grant. "Mr. Scott, I'm so sorry to tell you this. My father, he passed away today. A stroke in Iowa." Randolph thanked her softly, hung up the receiver, and sat in absolute silence for 5 minutes. There were no tears, no audible sobs, only a vast, echoing emptiness, as if a vital part of his own soul had just been precision cut away. He stood up, opened his liquor cabinet, poured a glass of bourbon, and sat gazing out the window. Outside, Los Angeles hummed with its usual indifferent energy. The world does not stop when a man departs, no matter how much light he once brought to the screen. The letter. 3 days later, Randolph sat at his writing desk. He wasn't there to write an obituary or a public tribute. He was writing a letter. A letter to Cary Grant. A letter he knew would never be mailed, but he had to write it. It was the only way to finally say goodbye. "Cary, you've gone on ahead of me. I'm not surprised. You were always the impatient one. 54 years. We loved each other for 54 years. 12 at Bachelor Hall, 42 in the shadows. But you know what? I don't regret a single second of it. People ask me if I would change anything if I could do it all over again. The answer is no. Because 1 hour sitting beside you in that beach house, listening to the waves and not having to pretend, that was worth more than a lifetime of performing for the masses. War taught me this. Survival isn't about winning the battle. It's about protecting what truly matters until the very last second. I protected it. I protected us. You told me you'd save a seat for me. I believe you. You never were one to break a promise. See you soon, Randy. P.S. I've kept the Bachelor Hall photo. No one will find it after I'm gone. I've made arrangements for it to be buried with me. Some things are too sacred to leave behind for this world to judge. 3 months later, March 2nd, 1987. Randolph Scott passed away in his sleep. No pain, no drama. The funeral was a private affair, only family and a few close friends. No reporters, no cameras. As the casket was lowered into the earth, Randolph's son Christopher placed one final object inside. The photograph in the reinforced glass frame. The image of Bachelor Hall, 1933. No one asked why. It was his father's final command. The legacy of the Guardian. Years later, when fragments of Randolph's letters and diaries began to surface, the world finally glimpsed the full story. But by then, Randolph was long gone, beyond the reach of those who would demand explanations. He had completed his mission. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, and he certainly wasn't a victim. He was a master strategist, a man who understood that sometimes the only way to win is to become invisible. Their love was like a seed hidden deep in the frozen earth throughout a long, bitter winter. The world thought it was dead, but when the season finally changed, it sprouted. Today, their story has become part of history, not as a scandal, but as a testament to the quiet power of patience.